whale's ship was my Yale College and my Harvard. Melville, too, was denied a secondary education after his father died, and he had to take to sea as a common sailor. Tito adopted Ishmael's cheerful stoicism, turning the limitations of our virtual relationship into a kind of advantage. And so I began to sharpen my harpoons behind the computer screen. There are harpooners who chase college degrees. Harpooners like me chase whales, hoping to catch the perfect whale in the shape of literature. You can hear in Tito's remarks something of Melville's resolve. When we later read Andrew Delbanco's biography of the writer, Tito saw just how indomitable a will Melville had. The man overcame mountains of debt, a literary marketplace that couldn't make sense of his finest work. One reviewer referred to Moby Dick as so much trash. I kid you not. The death of 2 sons, and a persistent despondency. After we returned from our trip to Arrowhead, I asked Tito what he had learned. I can feel the rejection, the determination, and all we heard about Melville, and I realize that I'm not the only person in the world that I must pity. Skype became a marvelous way to encounter Moby Dick, especially as Tito settled on the novel's phantom antagonist as his primary figure of identification. It was as if I were a masthead watchman and he a leviathan, each of us spotting the other at a great distance and singing out with enthusiasm, "Hello, Tito. Hello, Professor." When the connection faltered and the picture blurred, this seemed especially true. The wavy lines like seas in rough weather. Our tutorial, though, was not so much a hunt as a cooperative undertaking between man and whale, neurotypical and autist. We were rewriting the story of Captain Ahab's demonic quest as we read it, page by blustery page. Tito described our process. I think this is an amazing paragraph. We each have Skype accounts and use them to discuss the novel face to face. Once a week, we spread the worded whale out in front of us. We dissect its head, eyes, and bones, careful not to hurt or kill it. The professor and I are not whale hunters. We are not letting the whale die. We are shaping it, letting it swim through the web with a new and polished look. I see the professor's face floating on the computer screen. I see my face in a smaller box below, wondering about its projected image. Perhaps my face, like Moby Dick, floats on his computer screen. Students sometimes complain that studying literature kills it. Tito understood the purpose of our discussions, which he wittily contrasted with the whale's gruesome slaughter and dismemberment. The reassembled novel moved in our conversations like the great mammal itself. Breaching the surface, its complexity glistened in the light of our shared engagement. When our tour of Arrowhead was complete, we descended the stairs and walked out to the barn behind the house. There were T-shirts to buy in the gift shop. The one that Tito chose said, "I prefer not to," which was, of course, a line from Melville's short story, Bartleby the Scrivener, and it has a lot of loaded meaning when Tito is wearing it on his chest. Mine said, "What would Queequeg do?" which was, of course, a twist on the popular Christian saying, "What would Jesus do?" For me, part of Moby Dick's appeal lay precisely in Ishmael's decision to befriend the Polynesian harpooner over and against what his culture, and importantly, his religion, told him about savages. In the beginning of the novel, as the Pequod is being prepared for its voyage, the two must share a bed at the Spouter Inn. There are no other beds or rooms. And after getting riled up about the wild cannibal with a tomahawk between his teeth, Ishmael declares, "What's all this fuss I've been making about? The man's a human being just as I am." The next morning, he comically awakens to find Queequeg's pagan arm thrown round him. Try as he might, he can't, quote, unlock his bridegroom clasp. "The harpooner hugged me tightly," Ishmael says, furthering the matrimonial conceit, quote, as though naught but death should part us twain. Some 10 chapters and a few adventures later, he cryptically alludes to the Pequod's demise. Ishmael, of course, will be the only survivor. I clove to Queequeg like a barnacle, yea, till poor Queequeg took his long last dive. The novel makes a powerful case for embracing differences of all kinds, including, Tito would come to believe, autism. Because Tito identified with the creature whose liquid life seemed analogous to his own sensory one, he too felt hunted. Encountering Ahab, he compared the captain's obsession with killing Moby Dick to our culture's obsession with vanquishing autism. Just as Ahab believes that the white whale maliciously took his leg, so many people believe that autism maliciously takes their children. Of his infernal antagonist, Ahab proclaims, I see in him outrageous strength, with an inscrutable malice sinewing it. The inscrutable thing is chiefly what I hate. Like Moby Dick, the classically autistic represent a lamentable enigma. Try as you might, you cannot crack the mystery of their strange behavior. You cannot penetrate their wordless gaze, or so the stereotype contends. At the very end of the novel, just before delivering to Moby Dick what he hopes is a fatal blow, Ahab screams, to the last I grapple with thee. From hell's heart I stab at thee. For hate's sake I spit my last breath at me. Tito's conceit may seem hyperbolic until you consider the kind of fundraising advertisements that an organization like Autism Speaks supports. I am autism, a particularly infamous one declares. I'm visible in your children, but if I can help it, I'm invisible to you until it's too late. I work faster than pediatric AIDS, cancer, and diabetes combined. Becoming louder and more demonic, the voice in the ad sneers, if you are happily married, I will make sure your marriage fails. Your money will fall into my hands, and I will bankrupt you for my own self-gain. With glee, it then alludes to the plight of underfunded researchers, the heroes in this implied drama of good and evil. Your scientists don't have the resources, and I relish their desperation. As Tito well knew, ferociously negative depictions of autism have consequences. Like a kind of awful clockwork, the news regularly coughed up stories of parents murdering their autistic children. In 2015 alone, 70 autistics died at the hands of family members. A couple of years ago, a wealthy New York businesswoman was convicted of manslaughter in the death of her 6-year-old non-speaking son. After trying all manner of quack treatments and still not finding a cure, she forcibly fed the boy a lethal concoction of painkillers and anti-inflammatories. To be certain that he consumed this concoction, she stuck a syringe, I want to say a harpoon, down his throat. And recently a woman in Oregon parked her car on a bridge, this one, and threw her 6-year-old non-speaking son into the waters of Yaquina Bay. And this happened to my birth son. The attempt, at least. My adopted son, rather. When I try to picture this boy, this one, the wind on his face, that orange spider perched in the sky, his mother yanking him toward the rail, I shudder at how perilous the masthead of autism really is. And with one half-throttled shriek, Ishmael says, you drop through that transparent air into the summer sea, no more to rise forever. One of the most dangerous jobs on a whaling ship was being up there on that masthead. Even scientists, no matter how dispassionate their work, play into the narrative of relentless pathology. You have calculated the intelligence of an autistic person, Tito writes. You have measured his skull and found it bigger than others. You have measured the white matter over gray matter. You have measured his emotions. But could you help me to calculate the number of steps to the moon? Tito would rather live on that desolate, rotating orb than perpetually confront the medical and education establishments, to say nothing of the autism alarmists. In a satire of the rising incident rate of autism, Tito quips. Beware, beware, 1 out of 88, or 88 out of something, or something out of 88, or perhaps I'm getting confused because 88 looks like 2 giant infinities, heads down, bodies up. They have no legs to run. He's a very, very witty writer, very witty. It is for this reason that Tito appreciated Ishmael's defense of the whale in Moby Dick. The way that Ishmael applauds how the whale sees differently, hears differently. So let's see if I got this. I do. Okay. So about the mammal's inability to speak. Sorry, I just clipped something accidentally. Okay. Here it is. It is for this reason that Tito appreciated Ishmael's defense of the whale, the way that he celebrates the creature's magnificent alternative to human vision and hearing. The concept of neurodiversity doesn't just apply to variation within our species. It applies to animal variation as well. While the whale's vision has its drawbacks, among other things, a considerable gap at the center of the visual field, it also has its advantages. By working in a monocular fashion, so the 2 eyes are monocular, each eye retains its autonomy. As a result, the whale's brain, according to Ishmael, I'm really getting messed up here. Go back one more. There we go. Can at the same moment of time attentively examine 2 distinct prospects on one side of him and on the other in an exactly opposite direction. Imagine a man, Ishmael boasts, simultaneously going through the demonstrations of 2 distinct problems in Euclid. Ishmael also celebrates the virtues of the whale's ear, and pointing out how wondrously minute it is, he comments, "Is it not curious that so vast a being as the whale should see the world through so small an eye, and hear the thunder through an ear which is smaller than a hare's? But if his eyes were as broad as the lens of Herschel's great telescope, and his ears capacious as the porches of cathedrals," is there anybody better at metaphor than Herman Melville? I don't think so. "Would that make him any longer of sight or sharper of hearing? Not at all. Why then do you try to enlarge your mind, subtleize it?" Tito especially appreciated, I'm almost done, Ishmael's understanding of the whale's lack of speech. He's a non-speaking person in a speech-centered world. "Seldom have I known any, this is Melville, seldom have I known any profound being that had anything to say to this world, unless forced to stammer out something by way of getting a living. Ahab, in contrast, rails against the creature's silence. At one point, he approaches the carcass of a sperm whale and issues a command. Speak, thou vast and venerable head. Speak and tell us the secret thing that is in thee." Of course, the whale cannot speak. Moreover, it is dead. Approaching it once again, Ahab cries in frustration, "O head, thou hast seen enough to split the planets, and not one syllable is thine." Ahab is driven as much by the impossibility of communicating with his enemy as by the loss of his leg. Fully ensconced in a speech-centered world, he's incapable of recognizing his own ability to speak whale, or in the context of autism, to find other ways of communicating. Precisely because speech is considered the quintessential mark of the human, Tito is despaired of his inability to speak. Did you ever wonder how so much sound can hide in the inch and a half of a typical person's mouth? Tito asks. I guess you notice things like this when your own mouth contains but a few limited sounds. In a poem titled Harpoons, Tito maps the slaughter of whales onto a typical scene with a severely autistic child, ghoulishly intimating that violent death might be a form of speech therapy. And here's this great poem by Tito. And then I have one little paragraph. Harpoons. With harpoons they queried. They lacked finesse. He voiced no response except some noisy breaths, excavating sound from deep in his chest? What pointed questions? They injured his head. He breathed to explain how he talks with that head, great blubbery words that rise from his chest. Is there a mind, they wondered, inside that head? The sound of his answers, those cumbersome breaths, let blood uproot what's locked in his chest. I leave you with Tito's words and with the injunction to rethink what Nick Walker calls the pathology paradigm of autism. The damage we do imposing norms is immeasurable. Thank you very much for your time. I'm happy to take your questions. And apparently, if you're going to ask a question, you need to go to the mic in the aisle. I just remembered. Don't be bashful.
What, if any, effects have Tito and his story and his ability to link his experiences with autism to this well-known piece of media had in shaping the current state of the neurodiversity movement?
Great question. So, Tito's 32, 33 right now. And I think his own example, there have been documentaries in England. He's been on 60 Minutes. He's incredibly well known as a non-speaking person with autism. And he, along with a few others, have unleashed a movement of teaching non-speaking autistic people how to communicate in alternative ways. And many of these kids are now in high school, and some have gotten into college. So when my son goes to Oberlin, he was only the 9th non-speaking person ever to get a college degree, and was the first at a highly selective college. So that's changing. I'd say there are well over 100 non-speaking autistic folks in higher ed, and there are many, many more behind them. It's tough for Tito because he hasn't enjoyed the movement that he unleashed in terms of being included. So there's a kind of bittersweet quality to that. But thank you for your question. It's a really important one. What else? I'm happy to answer writing questions too about nonfiction. How do you braid all these different modes or impulses together? Whatever you want. Disability, creative writing.
One of those creative writing ones. I mentioned in my introduction that I'm sometimes stunned by your similes. This is one that I noticed in particular, and I guess I'm going to ask how you do this. This is from a different chapter in See It Feelingly. It's the one with Jamie and ceremony. But you write, Jamie reminded me of one of the reasons I had fallen in love with literature in the first place. It is a sanctuary for paradox. A Jurassic Park where roaring contradictions thrive long after, we might say, an asteroid struck the human mind with such force that it sent a cloud of rationality into the frontal lobes and precipitated their extinction. A paradox doesn't need to be resolved. It is a way of thinking multiple things at once, a way of moving beyond the restrictive categories of language. So I'm partly wondering how you do that. And since you're talking about literature and paradox, I'm going to invite you to say anything you want to about that as well.
Okay, so my first creative writing class when I was an undergraduate at Wesleyan was with Annie Dillard, who was so scary, so unimaginably scary. Her comment on my first poem was not fit for a dog's breakfast. That's the first poem. Do you want to hear what the comment was on the second poem? I remember this 40 years later, was grossly sentimental. Try sharing it with your family. And if you knew my family, that had an added edge to it. But Annie was tremendous at teaching analogical thinking. And so let me get at this through autism. So there was a pretty famous study asking autistic children to label objects. They were shown photographs of objects, and you were supposed to come up with the noun. And so this kid was doing this successfully. And then there was a photograph of a fancy pillow with welt cord, you know, the kind of pillow your parents have. You don't actually put your head on it. It's a fancy pillow, and it sits in front of the other pillows. And the kid says, ravioli. And it looks like a ravioli. The ability to think beneath the category, trying to come up with metaphors by linking things categorically is a disaster. Melville is a genius at operating below the category. So who knows? You know, did this boy just have ravioli for lunch? If it were me, I'm Sicilian, my grandmother made wonderful Italian food, I would imagine her bed is a bowl of pasta. I'm often running, and then I start thinking about pasta and pillow, both begin with a P, but I'm not thinking categorically. And Annie had us do exercises where we had to link really disparate things. So here's the paradox of metaphor. It has to be apt enough to be understood, but surprising enough to capture something that the ordinary word wouldn't capture. That's asking a lot, right? Because you can really do surprising, or you can really do apt, and really apt is probably a cliche. Somebody's already done it. So you can do these exercises where you train your brain to think beneath the idea and linking disparate things. And I do this probably, when I'm walking to class. I'll do it for 5-10 minutes every day. And 1 in 4 is just an absolute winner. It absolutely gets a poem going, gets an essay going. Would never have linked these things. So I could talk a lot more about this, because I actually think it's my job as a creative writing teacher to teach students how to think differently, to make these kinds of connections. So there has to be some kind of technique. Otherwise, you're asking people to be inspired. And that's a kind of vague thing. It doesn't regularly, being inspired does not regularly happen to me. So I need another way of writing at least a little bit every single day. At least a paragraph, a couple lines of a poem. What else?
Thanks so much for being here today, Ralph. I really appreciate your reading tonight and the conversation earlier today with the students. The Hofstra has your new book of poems, your pandemic poems, at the back of the room. And so we were wondering if you wanted to say anything about it. I will confess, this is my first look at it, but I noticed that the last poem is my son reads the previous poem, and since we've been in the earlier conversation, the first memoir that you wrote, your son DJ got the last chapter, and you've been talking about your relationship with him quite a bit today. So I wonder if that's an entry to talking about.
Sure. Can I borrow that copy? Please. And I'll read it. It's pretty short. During the pandemic, I was like one of those dogs that guarded hell. I would not let anybody out of my house or into my house. I was so not so about the pandemic, and I was becoming annoying. Very annoying, and I heard this from multiple parties. So in this poem, I tried to speak as my son as a way of getting to know or fathom how annoying I was. This is very hard for parents. You all know this. Your parents do not know how to understand how annoying they are. I mean, it's built into the setup. So here's this poem. The gate agent from hell. That's you, Dad. A veritable Cerberus, hound of Hades. You have snakes coming out of your butt, an oversized belly. Your serpent's tail needs a good waxing. And get a haircut while you're at it. Who could ever want 3 heads, overthinking and oversmelling everything? You're charging extra for rollerboards. You're not letting dead families sit together. You're barking into the microphone. How about a little customer service? Those of us in Abraham's bosom, those of us wearing a pine overcoat, those of us picking turnips with a stepladder, or basting the formaldehyde turkey. We're tired, Dad. Cut us some slack. Who cares if terrorists rush the cockpit? We're as terror-stricken as we could be. I just want to go out onto the front lawn of life and wave at the cars. And, my son was really, really pleased. He says, Dad, let me write that poem, but I think you did a pretty good job of capturing how annoying you've been or during that time. So, yeah, this came really fast, this book, because my mom was in a facility in Boston. 28 people died in her facility, everyone on her floor. And so she was so scared that I was teaching my Zoom classes with my iPhone going. She was reading the books, but we would hear the sirens and sobbing, the students would. I mean, I explained what was happening, and I really needed to do this for my mom. She wanted a connection that was going to last through this horror show. My mom died a couple of weeks ago and actually got COVID finally in hospice. The ironies of just this pandemic are brutal. So I wrote a bunch of these poems, including how do you teach on Zoom? What was it like to be trapped in our houses or our dorm rooms? What's been taken from us? But also tried to bring some humor to it, because I'm not sure we're that ready to be that grimly serious again. So I'm going to give this back to you, or I will take it. Anything else?
First, thank you. My Melville bag. Now my students.
Oh, look at that! I would prefer not to. That's
Yes.
good.
I have a question about the intersection between memoir, activism, and exposure, and vulnerability. So, in terms of exposure for yourself, for your family, for your son, and why you felt it was worth the risk to share that story with others on the page.
Really profound question. So my memoir comes out in 2007. We're on Anderson Cooper a bunch of times, NPR. After Anderson Cooper, we had 6,000 emails in 1 hour, and some of them really, really scary, like from the Hypnotist Society of Annapolis, Maryland, saying they'd get him talking in 20 minutes, from some evangelical groups that were going to do an exorcism, just a whole range of things that really I wasn't prepared for. With that book, I wouldn't have published it if DJ hadn't given me permission to do it, and if my wife and I didn't expose ourselves to an equivalent degree in the book. And he had the last chapter, which I only read when it was published. And he told me all sorts of things that I got wrong, and it was painful. But I really think that was a part of this process of writing so publicly. DJ's experience with his birth family and in foster care, he really, really wanted to help other foster kids, and he started feeling so guilty about the luck of being adopted that he really needed to do something. So this was part of, the tagline of his movie is "Inclusion shouldn't be a lottery." The tagline of this is, that tagline speaks to a desire to not just be the recipient of some, basic goodwill. I think we're the lucky ones, just by the way. I mean, I cannot tell you how this young man has transformed my life in ways that are just amazing to me, amazingly rich. And then, because of the Diane Rehm show, all these Hollywood people came. I turned the Harlequin Romance Network, whatever that thing is, down, and this director, documentary director, he'd actually done Charlie's Angels, so it wasn't as if he wasn't also a Hollywood person. But he wanted to do a documentary, and I said, well, you do it with DJ. DJ got to, at the end of my book, he's speaking for himself. but you have got to make him a full partner. So he had a full share of editorial control, and thank God, because the battles, this movie took so long to come out because they wanted a Disney sort of overcoming movie. That unleashed, because it's been on PBS, it's going to be on PBS again for about the 4,000th time in a week during the month of October. That unleashed, it was unbelievable. The hardest part about it was trying to honor hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of emails and calls from really good-hearted people who want help. You know, because it is really, we leveraged enormous cultural capital and money to allow DJ first in Florida and then in Iowa to be fully included and to have the life he's having, right? But I'll answer. I said this to the students earlier today. This will sum it up. So as DJ's making the movie, he's at school in Ohio. I'm in Iowa. He sends me a clip of me totally losing it, having the worst adult meltdown, like just really, really, really embarrassing, right? And so, as I was telling the students earlier, I write to DG by email. I said, I find this to be very powerful material. It's very compelling, but I wonder if it fits with the narrative arc that you're going for. So a couple of hours later, I get an email from him, and this is all it says is, how does it feel? Like when you're representing people, even when you're doing it, especially when you're doing it in a good-hearted way, it's peril. It's peril. And so the solace I take is that, and we just wrote an article together about all of these media in one family, two guys writing across 5 genres, including film, about each other. And Scholar has a nice term that I like, a narrative ecology, that we're just adding stories and then correcting on the fly. And, you know, we just keep going because he's got a book of poems coming out next week or 10 days. And he's got some poems about me. They're like, I don't like that one. I don't know. I don't think I'm that bad. But on the other hand, I'm also like, you know, we're all radically imperfect people trying to love one another. And, you know, he has a sense of what point of view means, a really deep sense of it. And so it is a lot of exposure, a lot of exposure. And sometimes, you know, because there are also people who are opposed, who don't believe that non-speaking autistic people are competent, who say we're frauds, who make these claims about DJ having never met him. There's big business here in terms of how you approach this particular group. So I could show you some hate mail that I'll get some hate mail every week that you just have to learn to, you know, ignore. And recognize that we're in the middle of a profound paradigm shift where the society is not yet ready to provide opportunities for people who are significantly disabled in this way. It's learning how to do it, and it better speed that process up. Thank you for your question. Anything else?
Speaking as a person who's neurodivergent, how do you go about constantly challenging the ableism that isn't constantly a part of our society besides advocacy? It's a thing that, without thinking, can occur in writing and telling these stories and narratively weaving them. How do you go about that for you in the case?
Yeah. Wow. I mean, another really, really important question. I guess, you know, I went to a small liberal arts college, and I was lucky enough to get a job at a small liberal arts college that wanted me to teach literature, creative writing, disability studies. You have to sort of be good at a lot of things. That has helped me because I don't think of like, I'm now putting on my activist hat. I think of these things as all mysteriously informing one another. And so I think when I go to McDonald's with my son, I'm admitting it, I go to McDonald's, we like the fries, that's activism. That's managing other people staring at my son, looking at me, coming up and saying terrible things. Once a stranger, complete stranger came up to me and said, "It's such a shame he's so good looking." Imagine being that available to other people's gawking and commentary. So you have to learn to see that every moment in your life is a moment in which all of these things might come together. And that's the thrill that I get from writing, really, is making connections. And I've sort of taken it out into other domains, I would say. But it's hard to be the person that has to teach other people to be decent. It's hard to do that every day. It really is hard to do that. It's so much easier for me than my son. I can move through a public space and be invisible if I want to be invisible. I'm just an old bald guy, you know. But my son doesn't have that luxury. And so, we have lots of conversations about recharging. You don't have to fight every single battle. And there's a wonderful neurodivergent community online. I mean, the activism. This is why we have neurodiversity now. Like, it's amazing. My wife and I published the first edited collection on this concept in 2010. 12 years later, this concept has so infiltrated the culture because of neurodivergent people. And the rest of the culture catching up to recognize just how much talent has been left untapped across the board. And this book was about, let's not be stereotypical in our assessment of what autistic talent is. Like Tito's one of the best writers I've ever read. He's just an amazing, amazing writer. And we have read in 15 years, we've met every single Saturday for 15 years. We've read, I don't know, 1,800 books. Everything, you name it, we've read it. We've read all of the poems of everybody. I mean, it really feels like that. And and I told him I'll do it until, I'm alert, conscious, and able to turn on the computer. And we love it. It's like some kind of life raft of meaning. And I also am keenly aware that he doesn't have the rich, varied life that my son has. A lot of it has to, he's got a single mom, he emigrated from India. These opportunities are distributed really unequally. And we all try to do our little part to correct for that. Anything else?
When you said that autistic people use the back of their brain more than other people, what did you mean by that?
So if you think, for example, of the visual cortex, so when they've done these studies, and the first part of the study is pretty good, looking at activation in the visual cortex for solving, let's say, a math problem. Why would an autistic person use this part of the brain when a non-autistic person is using the other brain? Interestingly enough, there's no difference in error rate or time. So in the second half of the study, the scientists then pathologize the way autistic people tended to do it in that study. So the real lesson here is there are all sorts of ways to skin a cat, right? What I'm trying to suggest is I think there's more room for those of us who are not autistic to really engage these other regions of the brain. And I really think creative writers are doing this. They may not know that they're doing it, but the only way to bring an experience to life on the page is to use the sensory to put people there. And there's some really good new research on multisensory images. The creative writers out here, use a multisensory imagery. You'll put the reader right there, right in that spot with a multisensory image rather. So this was just noticing something that's coming out of the research, and also thinking about how might you cater toward certain kinds of learning styles. We already talk about that. We're starting to learn more from brain science about what that might mean and how we might do that better. I mean, that's a short answer. I've got a long-winded answer from having been at the Brain Institute, but I will spare you.
So you're talking about how you got like various amounts of hate mail at different times and different people's reaction.
Yeah.
And then you're also bringing up the way that the pandemic kind of split society. What are some of like the biggest environmental shifts that you noticed, like coming out of the shutdown compared to before the shutdown?
So everybody wants to go back to the way it was. So one of the upsides, perverse upsides of the pandemic was accessibility using Zoom. So many people with disabilities could now study in ways that were comfortable to them that didn't add stress. And now we sort of want to imagine, well, that was good. It was for a pandemic. Now it's really hard on professors. Like I find it really difficult to do the hybrid model, watch the chat. On the other hand, what's our job? What's our obligation? We should be as accessible as humanly possible. And so my great worry is the desire to do away with masks, go back, that we might actually forget some of the positive things the pandemic taught us. So that would be one. And we're noticing it, like we actually figured out how to do Zoom talks with lots of people. My son did an incredible talk with Frances McDormand and Bill Murray. He's so not a bragger. So he says, Dad, I'm doing this Zoom talk. I rarely ask you to do this. Could you log on? I log on, and there's my son's head, and there's Bill Murray. And he's like, and every time DJ says something, right on, DJ. So we could do it. There were 5,000 people on that call, and somehow they figured out how to do questions. We rose to the occasion, and we figured out how to do it. Do I like in person better? Maybe. I mean, the thing with Tito has taught me that there's also a kind of intimacy that can happen strangely across the airwaves that might not be happening in person as readily. So I think that's the first thing that really comes to mind. Anything else? You guys have been great. Thank you for your time and for listening, and for your questions. It was really a lot of fun talking earlier to the students and doing this. So thank you very much. Yeah, come. Great.
If you'd like to get him to sign.